Welcome, Emma and Mitchell from Happy City. Mitchell is the experiments lead and urban planning and design lead for Happy City. As one of his recommenders comment about him in LinkedIn, he is an enthusiastic individual who often walked an extra mile to be able to deliver. I always like to find things to say about people that are not your usual CV. So thank you for joining us, Mitchell. And Emma, we didn't have any recommendations there, so I picked out your own statement about being passionate about power and inclusive dialogue to strengthen engaged communities and catalyze systems change. So that's a good description, I think, of who you are. And I am now going to stop sharing and welcome you two to say hello and get started. We're going to have a maybe 10-minute presentation roughly, and then I have a bunch of questions I've set to Mitchell and Emma, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the crew. So over to you, Mitchell and Emma.
Sounds good. Thank you for the introduction. Mitchell is just going to get our PowerPoint ready, but yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Emma Clayton Jones, and like Diane said, I work in planning at Happy City.
And I'm Mitchell Reardon. The short form that I go usually by is senior planner, but I do like experiments lead. And we're from Happy City. We're a Vancouver-based planning and design consultancy, and we use well-being to make city or well-being lens to make happier, healthier, and more inclusive cities. And today we're really happy to be here. So thank you very much for the invitation. And we're fortunate to be able to share some of the work that we did with the Canadian Urban Institute over the summer, which included this toolkit, the Rapid Placemaking to Bring Back Main Street toolkit. And we're going to go through a little bit of that today. So we're glad to be here and look forward to the dialogue that will follow this short presentation.
So since COVID-19 has hit, we all know that people have found really creative ways to use the main streets around them. So we've all seen Canadians use streets that would typically prioritize cars to access essential jobs and services by foot and bike, to meet friends and neighbors on new patio spaces, and to use art to share messages of hope and gratitude. We've also seen people take up Main Street space to grieve and to protest the racist treatment of Black and Indigenous peoples within communities and by police. And as reopenings occur, businesses and cities are expanding patios and public spaces into main streets across the country. At the same time, many main streets are struggling to keep businesses open, and this is of particular concern as we move into the colder weather. So we move through this process that Mitchell was mentioning with one central thesis, which is that a main street is only as powerful as its community. Research indicates that during lockdown, the most resilient main streets were those with strong community connections. During the same period, societal inequalities were laid bare, and we saw that vulnerable and marginalized communities faced the greatest impacts of COVID-19. So as such, equitable engagement can support a just recovery, local business, and community. And that's because the success of main streets and the success of communities is intertwined. While we know that community is essential to Main Street recovery, we also know that cities, BIAs, and other groups have been faced with the challenge of responding really quickly to the COVID-19 crisis in order to keep people activated and to keep the economy moving. And as a result, we know that they have left people behind. Engaging communities in the process of reshaping and reimagining main streets in towns and cities across the country is vital to a holistic pandemic recovery. A just recovery is fundamental to creating a better normal. And there are some places where this has resulted in main streets that have stayed safe and bustling and inclusive during the pandemic. So Commercial Drive in East Van, and this is the photo on the right here, in Vancouver is one example. And on the left, we have downtown Vancouver, where we don't see such bustling community right now. So this is the approach that we took to go through the Bring Back Main Street process. So this involved on-site assessment, speaking to cities across the country. We did desk research, we engaged residents and community members. We did field research, so went out in the cities and communities where we're working. We did a focus group involving business improvement associations, and we conducted a studio to bring together urban thinkers from across the country to brainstorm some solutions. A coordinated approach can be really challenging anytime that an array of actors are working together. That's because short timelines, emerging ideas, and changing situations can further complicate coordination. So these evidence-based well-being principles are designed as a framework to inform our processes, programming, and interventions to bring back Main Street. And we use them to formulate the ideas that we will talk about below.
This builds on more than a decade of Happy City research that we've used to create this sort of framework, and then we tailor the principles to match the project at hand. Specific to this case, we were looking at main streets, and we were looking at rapid placemaking for recovery. In a lot of cases, this focuses on street space, and so we were thinking in this very broad context. We were looking nationally and had a directive to be looking at like main streets in big city centers like Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, as well as the suburban settings where a lot of people find themselves. So looking at strip malls that have a lot of independent businesses and other settings like that. And then into more rural settings as well. And with my family in Rossland, a small town in interior BC, I was certainly thinking of their great little one street main street as well. And these were a few of the examples that that we were working with. So, you can extend the sidewalks. So to take space previously used for parking to extend this space. And the critical piece here is that if you're removing parking, to be extremely careful about maintaining spaces for people with disabilities, as that access is critical to a more equitable city. We had the chicane approach, where you could take some of the space and just narrow what was available to cars and allow for more space for businesses, as well as pop-up patios for the public. You can take open streets where you fully transform a street and remove vehicles from it entirely, or you can take the opposite approach, which would be using a side street, plaza, or parking lot to activate that space, thereby maintaining the flow of vehicles on the main street. And the critical piece here is, however you choose to do this, ensure that you are not adding barriers to the public realm, particularly for people who use mobility devices. So it can be a little harder to get around, to navigate, say, when a patio extends onto a sidewalk if you're using an electric wheelchair than if you're on foot. The same goes for walkers and strollers and other things. And yeah, making sure that you don't take away parking from people with disabilities is also just a really critical piece to ensuring that both the businesses and communities thrive, but also specific communities who've often been ignored or simply overlooked in previous efforts to make better streets. So we tend to use a process that involves, I'd say, roughly 4 steps, which is learn, listen, create, realize, and then we always have the space to add the extra piece of assessment on, depending on the type of project. Here we thought it would be really important to consider the inspiration as well. And so effectively we have this 6-step process, and this is what we use to come up with our ideas. And within the toolkit, we encourage everybody to, or encourage anybody who is interested to think about their ideas and map them out using the blank pages in our toolkit, which we'll come to shortly. But effectively, we use the 6-step piece of inspiration, ideation, implementation, engagement, iteration, and assessment. And the really important thing here is to see that with this, rapidly advancing process and things, out of necessity occurring quickly, that there can be overlap, and we need to be comfortable with this fluidity to the process. And it would, of course, vary by context, but you'll notice that, for instance, engagement actually starts in the implementation stage, or we encourage that and allow it to continue into iteration. And ideation continues through as well. And a third example would be how assessment can begin during the iteration stage. So you're using it to see how well an idea is working and adjust accordingly. So you might look to things going on in your city or elsewhere for the inspiration. So in Vancouver, we saw a lot of businesses putting up patios, as you see in the foreground, but in the background, you can also see this pop-up patio that the city put out as a new public space. And we thought this was a pretty good space in that it pairs public and private benefit and creates an even more active space accordingly. But whatever you look to, you're going to need some inspiration to get started. And from there, you can start to work through the ideation stage, which here we're looking at the needs and desires of key groups on Main Street. So community and business are, of course, the critical elements that we looked into and the communities that we focused on. But all of this is within the parameters established by the governance framework available. And here you can see the blank page where you could take from our toolkit, either print it out or do it online, to put your own ideas in here and see how you're meeting the needs of the community and businesses within the framework that the governance structure in your location allows. From there, you go into implementation, engagement, and iteration. So this is a pre-COVID picture, as you might have guessed, but basically this was a chance to reallocate Main Street and demonstrate what some temporary bike lanes for children might look like. And we built a bunch of street furniture to go with it. We heard what was working, what we can adjust. We saw, yeah, what made sense within these contexts. So this was, of course, this was a rapid process, but allowed us to think about ways to improve what we're doing. So for instance, this bench didn't have a backrest, and a lot of older folks liked having the backrest to ensure that they were able to get up and sit down with ease. So that was something we included in some of our future designs. And then assessing whatever you've implemented is also really important. And you know, there's been a lot of discussion about how you can do that safely during the pandemic, and we've been fortunate to work with a number of partners and clients who have been very eager to do this. So on the left, we see a picture from the McInnes Overpass in New Westminster, and the city of New West hired us to, once their interventions were in place, they hired us to help kind of create a cohesive plan around it and then conduct engagement, both focused and pop-ups, and public life studies. And what you see here is the public life study underway. We had pretty rigorous COVID protocols in place for this. Contactless engagement, whether that was by phone, which was one option, and paper, which was the other. And on the other side, we have the brewery well-being study, which 5 breweries in Vancouver hired us to help create a well-being case to justify why they should be able to keep their patios long-term. In this case, we want to keep it very light on the labor, but also on the engagement needed to fulfill this. So if you went to faculty, R&B, Main Street, Lupolo, or Slowhand Brewing over the last over August and September, you might have seen a QR code and a little coaster like this on your table. And this led you to surveys. So there were ways to conduct assessment. You had to be a little bit more careful and jump through a few more hoops, but it was all possible. Let's see. Just from the toolkit, we wanted to share a couple of ideas and to kind of show you how we went about our thinking. So we considered which well-being principles were being fulfilled and sought to ensure that multiple principles were being fulfilled. We looked at the cost of conducting these type of activities, how long it would take to organize, whether it would be winter friendly or not, what materials would be necessary for this, and then looked at how we could justify whether this was a good idea or not. And critically, we focused on both design interventions as well as programming, because those are the two key pieces together that are built successfully off a rigorous process. We also noticed in a number of places that there was awareness about the need to ensure accessibility was considered within the projects, but it often didn't land exactly how it was envisioned, I don't think. So here we have an example where, you know, they'd extended the patio space and they'd included the wheelchair ramp, but that ramp led you right into a barricade, and then you couldn't really navigate clearly down this path because of the way that the chairs were located. And while it might be technically feasible to turn an electric wheelchair on this space, the radius might be large enough, it certainly doesn't provide a feeling of welcomeness and inclusion that this was meant for you. So one of our other ideas was about a ramp that came sideways, as it allows a little bit more space for people to access the sidewalk, and is better tailored to the safety, comfort, and well-being of people who are using wheelchairs, scooters, and other devices, and also allows for the fluid passage of people within the constraints of a single car lane, which is what most places have chosen to remove in this setting. And finally, just the third example was these "We're Open" stickers, which had been coming up in some places, but what we thought could be more widely spread. So this was an idea that was already in use, and we just sought to enhance and amplify it, where you can help to describe, where say an entire BIA, that was the kind of core focus for this work, would be able to describe how the businesses within their area are open or operating, and in doing so, ensure consistency and understanding for both clientele and an additional piece of safety for the businesses that we're trying to run. Here's just an example of the blank page. So if you go to the website, which we'll show you at the end, you'll find all the blank pages throughout to help you use this toolkit for your own use. And this is going to become really important because we had a chance to work through the summer and saw all the great work going on there and the space for improvement that was possible. But now we're coming into winter, and we know that the transmission of COVID-19 is more likely in indoor settings. A lot of indoor shared settings are particularly at risk. And so how do we support business while maintaining community in a safe and comfortable way through the winter? This is where we're at right now. And these are some of the things that we're starting to think about and happy to chat more about with you. Oh, and so here we are. So we'd be happy to take any questions, and you can see the link just below here, and I'll put it in the chat afterwards for where you can find the whole toolkit, which is, there's a single toolkit, there's a series of modules, and then there's a downloadable worksheet where you can work through our pages.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Mitchell and Emma. That's great. And when you can, go ahead and stop the screen share. Perfect. So so much to talk about in this presentation. But let's maybe zoom out a little bit and talk just sort of generally first about those relationships that we understand between urban design, sustainable planning, and human health, which I think encompasses more of the work you've done beyond the toolkit. You want to speak to that?
Sure, and I'm just putting the toolkit in the chat.
I think it's actually there already.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Nice. Yeah, maybe I'll jump in, and then Emma, you can add on as you see fit. So our founder and the author of the book that kind of catalyzed the work that we do now. So the book was called Happy City, and the founder, his name is Charles Montgomery, and also based here in Vancouver. And he'd started to notice that there was some relationship between the way we built our environments and a lot of the happiness that he was at least coming across, and the way people were presenting this to him. And he was a journalist, or he is a journalist, and was naturally curious about this, and spent a number of years along with some of a research team to learn a little bit more about this. And what he concluded was that the way we design our environments can help or hinder human happiness. And, critical elements include sociability, so the ability to interact with people with ease, and that is both people who you know well, friends and family, but having a positive encounter with a stranger that even lasts a few seconds can have a similar well-being boost to that of interacting with a loved one or friend. And this starts to manifest itself in all sorts of ways. So at Happy City, we look a lot at the public realm and some of the intersections with active mobility. Our colleagues in the housing team, led by Patty Rios, look at multi-dwelling units and what can be done to support social connection there. Of course, the ability to move actively is important, and critically, just not losing time to travel between sites, which would be a typical issue with driving by car, was really a big one. And in combination, if you have more people who are able to interact easily, able to walk to their destinations with ease, and able to have these sort of positive trust-building encounters with strangers along the way, you're also doing a lot to support local business, as businesses that can be accessed on foot tend to be local and be more easily supported by the people in their neighborhoods. And you're also reducing dependence on the private car, so you're able to do some things to support the environment as well. So in a nutshell, the happy city, the healthy city, and the green city are all the same place. Kind of our starting point. Anything you want to add there, Emma?
No, that sounds great.
So the reason I invited you guys is because I saw the rapid placemaking toolkit in a newsletter actually from Public Square. Thank you, Janet. And I was really taken by your wheel of principles. So we've been talking a lot in this fall here around about the difference between fragility, anti-fragility, and resilience, and also kind of taking a systems perspective that principles rather than rules rules, for example, are ways to galvanize people moving in a direction, but enabling them to do the problem solving, if you will, in their own space. So I was really taken by them. And I guess I'd love to hear more about how you're seeing the principles be used. And I gather the principles are not just for this toolkit, but you had developed them ahead of time. So tell me a bit more about how people are using and how cities are using the principles in particular.
Yeah, I can jump in and speak to that a bit. So like Mitchell mentioned, Charles's research is the foundation of our work and the starting place that we're working from. So when he was researching the design, well-being, connection in cities, these are the principles that he developed as essential for health, happiness, and inclusion within cities. And I'm not sure if we're able to screen share and bring up the principles, but like Mitchell mentioned, those included ability to connect with others, ability to move around with ease. And we've actually, over time, we've begun to sort of move away from these principles being just rooted in academic research to now they're the principles, the foundational principles that we use in all our work. So we've begun to kind of take an empirical approach to using these principles to design city spaces, to design housing. And so we really look through the lenses of each of these principles when we do our own work. And in recent years, we've actually made a shift in our approach, informed by the learning that we've done as a consultancy and also by other urban thinkers. So we're really inspired by folks like Jay Pitter, by Robin Mizunder, by Gil Peñalosa, folks that are really thinking about equity in the urban realm. So we've taken equity from the outside of the wheel, where it originally was, as one of our principles, and moved it into the center. And that was something that we did for this project. Or this project was the first space that we've kind of tested out this shift in approach. But this is something that we're thinking about broadly across all our work. The idea that with each principle we're working through, unless we put equity in the center, we may be excluding some people or leaving some people behind. So moving forward, we're looking to really build that into the work that we do and sort of keep equity right in the center of our well-being wheel.
So I hope you can see them now. I think I've screen shared it, but I guess I want to ask what, and I'm going to take it away in a second, but which are the most valuable of these? And I'm not trying to prioritize them, but where do you see them actually working and being implemented? And can you give some examples of how you're seeing cities take some of these ideas and put them in practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they're really interconnected, and I think not all projects will speak to every element on the wheel. But one example of how it's being used and how the elements may be interconnected. Right now, we're working on a project to think about well-being in modular housing. And so we're thinking about how modular housing, temporary modular housing, which is being built really rapidly as a homelessness response, can lead to or contribute to social well-being. But in learning about social well-being and doing that through an equity lens, we're also learning a lot about how for some folks being able to connect socially with residents in their building will also contribute to harm reduction, will also contribute to health and allow people to get the food and resources they need. So often I think by focusing on certain parts of the wheel, we will end up taking a kind of holistic or learning about a holistic approach to well-being. But Mitchell may have some more examples.
Yeah, I can add a little bit here. I should also just note that, so we use these elements for basically every project, and sometimes with private clients, there'll be a slightly narrower focus. But these elements come in each time, and then we tailor the principles, so the exact words, to match that project and the values that the people we're working with have. And so Bring Back Main Street was a really interesting project in that regard, in that we had to do something very actionable and defined, but for an incredibly broad audience. So nationally, big town, suburban, small town. So we were kind of working to kind of balance those pieces out. I think within this project, a good example would be before we started, or back, say, June, as these interventions started to occur, we saw a lot of businesses and BIAs focus on, okay, we got to make a good experience for our clientele. So let's say that we could describe that loosely as joy. But in focusing on the joy of their clientele, they could actually be making the conditions worse for other people. And so asking, for instance, who that joy is for would be a critical piece. And I feel like, we are in this state of evolution. The framework is in a general state of growth most of the time. We look back at our own ideas critically. I think a lot of the time we talk about sociability as just such an important one in terms of your well-being. Being able to interact with people, whether you are an extrovert or an introvert, is just so important, and feeling some connection is critical to your well-being. And I think we've been seeing a lot about the negative effects that physical distancing and the need to isolate have had on people's well-being. I saw a national report today talking about the negative impacts on mental well-being as a result of isolation. But then you had the for who question, and that really brings equity into it as well. So those really do feel like the two highest priorities. And yeah, we can make the adjustments to match with that for the projects at hand.
So shortly, I want to invite everybody to turn their videos on, but not just yet. I'll ask one more question before we bring people back into the conversation. And that is one of my favorite questions is, what brings you hope? Like, what are you seeing now during the pandemic that actually brings you hope? Maybe it's something that has accelerated in a positive direction, or the application of a new way of thinking. But what does that look like for you in the work that you do in as it relates to cities and placemaking, or anything else for that matter? Emma?
Yeah, I think one thing that has just been really exciting to see, I think we've been talking at Happy City for a long time about the ways that we really need each other. We need our communities, whether that's our neighbors or the people in our city, or the people that we interact with kind of in casual ways throughout the day. We really need those people to feel good and to get what we need. And I think over the pandemic, we've really seen a broader conversation about that. And I think that's become more clear to more and more communities. And it's just been really exciting to see those conversations happening, and also the ways that communities have been really supporting each other to get through this. And yeah, that makes me really hopeful about what we might be able to do with that moving forward.
Mitchell?
Yeah, I'd add that I feel that a much broader range of people are understanding the value and importance of the public realm. So parks just filled with people all summer long who look to gather comfortably and safely with their friends. Even last weekend, a dreary cold weekend in Vancouver, I saw at least 3 birthday parties taking place in parks. So they're just so important, and that recognition is much broader. And in itself, I don't think this is positive, but the outcomes have been a lot of the inequalities that were already existing in our society have been laid bare, and there's greater recognition of the need to address them. And so I think we're starting to see some of the issues around that, like open streets, for instance. Like, who are the streets open for? What does that mean? How do people feel within that? One that I think is coming up now in Vancouver as we enter the rainy months is shared covered space. So we have done a pretty good job of removing those spaces, but what are we going to do now that we need to meet in open covered spaces for a lot of the next 6 months? So I think starting to think about these questions or critically addressing them is going to be incredibly important moving forward.
Yeah, just thinking about the latest news in the case counts in BC and the linking of that to new public health orders about really completely reducing any thought of having people in your home to a very safe number in your bubble. That having outside spaces we can go is going to be critical to helping us get through, I think, the winter.